Montana Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife is an independent sportsmen's and sportswomen's organization. What we focus on mainly is projects and programs, issues that benefit Montanans. We're heavy into the predator control side of things.
Is should the citizens of the sovereign state of Montana be allowed to utilize their natural resources in a manner that they feel appropriate? A big solution, it's the only solution big enough, is the chair of the Montana SJ15 Study in Federal Land Management. She's the vice chair of the Montana GOP. She is the vice chair of the Montana Senate Judiciary Committee. She is a member of the Montana State Natural Resources Committee, Montana State Fish and Game Committee, Montana Environmental Quality Council, and Montana Water Policy and Interim Committee. And tonight you're going to hear the facts. I recently attended a workshop in Utah where 14 states were represented, and at the end we had a press release, an opportunity for the press to ask questions. And one of the questions that they asked was, why is it that you feel that you can do a better job managing the public lands in the federal government? And Jennifer was extremely profound in her response. It'll stick with me forever. She said, because our lives depend on it.
Amen.
And please join me in a warm welcome for Senator Jennifer.
You know, before I got assigned to all those committees in the legislature, I was really enjoying life here in Montana with my husband, Paul, who's a wildlife biologist, and we were doing a lot of hunting and fishing and trapping and hiking and canoeing and boating. And that's really what I'd rather be doing. But we saw a lot of our opportunities diminishing. And when you start looking historically at the access we used to have to the public lands and the jobs that we used to have related to the public lands, the environmental quality that we used to have on the public lands, it was all better 20 years ago than it is today. So that was one of the primary reasons I got involved in the legislature, was to protect our heritage, our ability to hunt, fish, and trap, to utilize our public lands, to provide jobs for our people, take care of our environment, and so forth. And when I tried to do that as a citizen, I got kind of ran into the brick wall over and over again. I read the 1,200-page forest plan for the Kootenai National Forest. Paul read the biology sections and studied those. I studied the public involvement processes and kind of the land management plans. I have a background in recreation planning. That's what I graduated from college in, is recreation planning. I love the outdoors. Paul loves working with wildlife. And what we saw in the forest plans alarmed us greatly. We saw bogus science. We saw top-down decisions that did not reflect any of the local input. We saw actually employees lying to us about what was in the plans, and when you read the plans, it's quite different than what they were telling us. So that was before I even got involved in politics. That really got me interested in doing something about it any way I could, and so I started, you know, as a citizen, just doing what I could to help educate people. We held some public meetings. This is a presentation I put together based on the federal land study that I chaired for the state of Montana. And it's also got information about this transfer of public lands issue. And you'll get the information on that and the facts. We'll have question and answers a little bit later. But I really want to thank Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife for having this meeting tonight. You know, I tried to go have a meeting with the board of the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and their director, and they would not allow us to meet with them. I'm still working on them, and if you're a member, I hope you'll work on them too and say, listen, we need to hear the facts on this issue. They already came out with an opposition statement against it without ever talking to any of the people that are actually working on this issue that are most knowledgeable about it. This is a copy of the bill that I introduced in the legislature my first session, which was 2013. This is called SJ15 Senate Joint Resolution. And all those signatures on there, when I took that original bill around, I had 48 hours to get other legislators to co-sponsor it with me. And this is the bill requiring the study of problems with federal land management and a search for solutions. I had 60 sponsors sign on to that, and I actually only had one afternoon of time available to go around and find people. And I was brand new and didn't know anybody, and I still had 60 people to sign my bill. So I took a photocopy of that original bill before I turned it in, and see the little 14-0 at the top? I had to present it to the first committee I presented it to was Senate Natural Resources. I presented the bill, presented the problems we have, the need to find solutions, and that bill passed a bipartisan committee 14-0. They acknowledge that we've got problems. And in the end, we ended up getting 85% approval from the legislature. This is a very strongly bipartisan-backed bill to study the problems of federal land management and find solutions to remedy those problems. Go ahead. So here's some of the language that was in that bill that all these people signed on to, Democrat and Republican. Management of U.S. Forest Service and BLM lands in Montana has a significant and direct bearing on Montana's environment, education funding, economy, culture, wildlife, and the health and safety and welfare of our citizens. It also said, federal funding and capacity for responsible management of U.S. Forest Service and BLM lands are in serious jeopardy, while critical threats such as beetle kills, invasive species, watershed degradation, access restrictions, and catastrophic fires continue to escalate. Again, 85% of the legislature agreed with that statement and supported this bill. The bill ended up getting ranked at the end of the session because it was a study bill, and there's other legislators that say we ought to study this and study that on different issues. And the legislators get to vote at the end of the session on which study is most important. We rank the studies. This study ranked as Montana's #2 overall priority. You'll never guess what the #1 priority was. Public employee retirement system. Anyway, so it was ranked very, very high. And we do have problems with the public retirement system, and we need to make sure that we're honoring the promises to those people that work for our state. SJ 15 was the name of the legislation. It was assigned to this Environmental Quality Council. That's a shot of the Environmental Quality Council there. We met several times throughout the last 2 years, in between the official legislative session of 2013 and this upcoming one that starts next month in 2015. We started out by surveying all of the Montana counties that have federal land in them, that have 15% or more of their land mass made up of federal land. That was something I wrote into the legislation. I knew we had problems in my area, but I wanted to find out if the other counties were having problems, and if so, what they were. So we ordered a survey to these counties. 28 of the 35 counties we surveyed responded and participated actively in this study. So that's an awful lot of Montana counties that participated in this. First thing we did after we sent out the questionnaire was we took a field trip. The Legislative Council, or Environmental Quality Council, took a field trip with the Forest Service, with the City of Helena personnel as well, up to the 10-mile watershed. And that's a watershed that has these, what were pristine, beautiful mountain lakes that supply Helena's drinking water. 70% of Helena's water supply comes from this area. And it was 95% dead and standing timber because of beetle infestations and lack of management. 95%. There were just a dot of a green tree here and there. It was like being in a graveyard. Unbelievable, the devastation that's up there. And it's just a hazard waiting to go up in flames. One lightning strike, and it can't be stopped. There's some firefighters in the room. You know what it's like to deal with a fire in that kind of country. I don't know that you can stop it until it gets to a point where you can put up some defense. Anyway, that area is at extreme risk of fire, and after the fire, the erosion. The U.S. Forest Service was in testifying on this and telling us about it. They hosted the tour, and they said they were hoping and trying to do something about it. And they were using the collaborative process to bring in different stakeholders and try to come up with a consensus on what they should do. Meanwhile, the City of Helena was able to start going and treating the acres on the land that they owned around those reservoirs. And they also were working with some of the private property owners to clear out the hazard on their land. Because it's one great big forest. There's some state land, there's some private land, and there's a whole lot of federal land in there. We saw no activity on the federal land until this year. They finally started a little bit of activity on there this year. And the reason that it got started is because the state stepped up and bailed them out. The state DNRC entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Forest Service and took the lead on getting the timber sale going. Some insights from that testimony that we received over the hearings, the process of hearings on this study from the Forest Service, were that they admitted, top administrators came to us and we questioned them on the record, and they admitted the conditions on the National Forest are worse today than they were 30 or 40 years ago. The U.S. Forest Service is no longer generating positive revenues. They used to produce positive revenues for our country. That all changed in the early 90s. The budget is predominantly allocated to fighting fires and fighting lawsuits. Up to 80 to 90% of the budget on the various ranger districts is allocated to fight lawsuits and fires after they ignite instead of in managing the timber. And then Congress They've cut their budget. They cut it 18% 4 years ago, then 5% the next year, then 8%, and then another 8%. And they're scheduled for 8% cuts indefinitely. So within 10 years, they got no budget at all. The forest supervisor for that 10-mile watershed, I asked him the question on the record, you know, what would you have done different if you could have done anything you wanted with this management? If you had nothing obstructing you, if you had all the money, if you had all the resources, what would you have done different? And his answer was, I'm not qualified to answer that question. And I don't know if he's qualified or not. He should be. He's the forest supervisor. It could be politically that he felt like he couldn't answer it. I'm not sure, but that was a really poor answer. In 2015, the Forest Service could treat up to 5,000 acres due to some new provisions that Congress put into the Farm Bill early this year. The Farm Bill had some things in there that give the Forest Service the ability to expedite treatments of these critical threat areas. The governor of Montana designated 5 million acres in Montana as imminent risk landscapes. That means they're either in jeopardy of serious decline in health, they are already impacted like that beetle kill in the dead growth that you see or the dead decay, or they're imminent risk to the communities that are surrounding. Governor Bullock designated 5 million acres of national forest in Montana under imminent risk for priority treatment. Okay, I asked the Forest Service on the record with the new provisions of the Farm Bill that everyone's touting as being the be-all, end-all savior to our problems. I said, how many acres do you expect to be able to treat next year? And they did not want to answer the question, and I continued, and I said, well, if you don't have any lawsuits filed against you, and if you have all the funding that you need, how many acres can you treat of this 5 million acres of high priority landscape? How many acres can you get next year? And finally they answered, and they said, we think we can get 4,000 to 5,000 acres. So I quick take out my calculator and I do some math and I say, well, that's 1/10 of 1% of the 5 million that the governor designated as high priority imminent risk landscape. I said, so we're on a 1,000-year plan? That's not good enough. Go ahead. So here's some responses we got back from the county surveys. And these are all on the record. They're part of the state records now. They're part of the SJ15 study, which any of you can access on the legislative website. 88% of the county said that wildfire conditions on federal lands pose a significant threat to public health and safety. Not moderate, not little, but a significant threat. 96% said the wildfire conditions pose a significant threat to public and private property in their county. Go ahead, Teresa. 96% said they believe current fuel loads on federal lands in their county could result in severe, not moderate, severe, uncontrollable, or catastrophic wildfires. 79% reported high-intensity wildfires as likely to cause a loss of important fish and wildlife habitat or harm threatened endangered species in their county. And 64% said that federal land management actually diminishes the water yield that supplies their citizens with water. 96% said motorized access is very important for sustenance activities for their citizens. Now I gotta brag a little bit, that's my husband and that's our woodshed. 68% said they want more multiple use access routes on federally managed public lands within their county. 32% of the county said they wanted to keep access as it is, but not one county said they wanted less access, multiple use access on the federal lands in their county. Yet tell me if you can find a forest plan that isn't closing more and more access. Every single one of them, BLM plans too, they're closing. They might open some access here, but net gain, we're losing big time every year. And then 58% of the counties also reported that the air quality in their county falls below acceptable health standards due to the fires beginning and originating on the federal lands. Ravalli County is one of the hardest hit in the state. In fact, western Montana is. 91% of the counties said their PILT, their payment in lieu of taxes that the federal government's supposed to give them for having the land, because they don't pay taxes on it, so they offer to pay us PILT. So 91% of these counties actually say PILT is not equivalent to the amount that actual land taxation will bring. So we have a new acronym for PILT. Instead of payment in lieu of taxes, we call it pennies in lieu of trillions. Northwest Montana has the most productive forests in the state. We've got world-class mineral deposits. We've got one of the biggest silver deposits in the world right up there in Sanders County. We can't access it. It's been in the permitting process for 30 years. 30 years, and the mining companies do everything to meet all the standards and then some, and they still can't get their permit. So how does that equate to our jobs? You would think we'd have good jobs, but no. Consistently, that corner of the state, this portion of Montana has the highest poverty and unemployment rates in the state. Our people are hurting, especially in rural Montana. Oh, here's that forest plan. This is out of the Kootenai National Forest Plan, Kootenai and Idaho Panhandle plans that my husband and I started reading back in 2011, I think. They were going to close off, and the plan called for closing off 2.1 million acres, putting them into grizzly bear recovery zones. And there would be no travel allowed in at least 55% of that area. So 1.2 million acres would not be allowed to have any roads in it. And I'm not talking about gated roads, I'm talking about you can't even walk on them. The plan says the roads have to be obliterated to the point that people cannot walk on them. And this is in their own words out of that plan, the alternative they selected. The selected alternative will limit our ability as resource managers to respond to fire, wind throw, insects, and disease, and to provide timber or other commodities. This is the Forest Service. They're supposed to be providing timber and other commodities. They're supposed to be managing the resource, yet the plan they selected will not allow them to do that. And then they were talking about secure habitat for the bears. What is a core area? What is a bear management unit core area? We couldn't figure out what that was really. They talked about putting 1.2 million acres into core area. Well, here's what it says. By definition, security or core habitat is an area or space outside or beyond the influence of high levels of human activity. Open roads, vegetation, and fuel projects, and high-use recreational areas such as trails or campgrounds are examples of activities that reduce the amount of secure habitat that is available and may result in displacement of bears. May result, not will result. So they're closing these areas to those kinds of activities. Now, this is something interesting that my husband Paul dug up when he was researching the biology aspects of their forest plan. This is actually an aerial photo of the bear GPS collar data. It shows where where the bears were. I think this is the Swan Valley, right, Paul?
Yeah.
Okay, so this shows where they're at, and that's the bottom, that's the valley bottom there, where the bears are spending all those yellow lines, that's where the bears are at. All those high country areas, they hardly go up there, and when they do, they go quick and then come back down. So the bears are spending their time where there's houses, where there's roads, where there's logging going on. They don't seem to be avoiding human activity, if you look, but they won't use this information in the forest plan. They will not. I've been working on it legislatively and otherwise to try to get them to use this information as they make their plans and policies for land management. And they will not use the modern stuff. They're still using the old pre-GPS era technology from 1980s, 90s. Okay, so here's some trends. These are some pretty bad trends we're seeing, and I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with this, but the Forest Service has told, several members have told me, they're not managing to manage timber anymore. They're managing to try to avoid lawsuits. And so look at what they've done since the 1980s. That's timber harvest rates, board feet sold in Montana. If you look back in the 1980s, it was pretty good on the different forests in Montana and the Idaho Panhandle up northwest by the Panhandle. But anyway, the rates of harvest started dropping in the early 90s. Well, that's when the Forest Service stopped making positive revenues for the country too, and they started losing money right there about where the graph bottoms out. They lost money. They've been losing it ever since. Our timber harvests are almost at a standstill. Let's go to the next slide. And then you can see with the decreased logging, we've got increased wildfires. These are volumes of wildfire acres burned in the red, and then the green line represents the volume of timber taken off the land. You got more fuel out there, you get the wildfires, they're bigger fires, there's more fuel for it to burn. And then this is a chart that started 100 years ago. This is the National Interagency Fire Center's data on wildfires, and you can see that the amount of acres burning now is historic. We've never seen these numbers before, not since we've been recording them in the last 100 years. So we've got some severe fires, and we don't have the funding or the capacity to be able to take care of them at the federal level. In fact, this is a U.S. Department of Agriculture report. When they came to the Public Service Commission of Montana, that's the commission that oversees all the utilities in Montana. And I went and sat in on that meeting and listened to their presentation, and they were there telling our Public Service Commission that there's nearly 1,000 miles of electrical transmission lines that are on national forests in Montana that are at risk. Those are just the ones at risk. There's more miles on there. But I found it kind of interesting that the Forest Service came and they gave this presentation called Forest Health and Western Utilities. And look at the picture they chose for the cover. What does that tell you? I mean, we've got some serious problems. It's not just our access, it's not just our timber industry. We're talking about the utilities that supply energy to every one of our homes. And in that report it said fires are becoming larger and more severe. Since 2010, western states have had record fire seasons. Trends indicate the amount of wildfire and associated damage will increase beyond our recent experiences, and the Forest Service does not have the budget to treat the affected acres. This is in their own words from their own report. So here you go. Have you seen this map? These are federally controlled lands in the United States. The red represents the lands that are under federal control. The white represents lands that are not. Do you see a similarity there? Let's go on to the next one. This is a calculation that was done. This is a very, very conservative estimate of how many animals are being burned up in these fires and how much pollution is being spewed into the air from them. This assumes 3 animals per acre, which is really low. It depends on what kind of habitat and conditions you have, but the acres support many more animals per acre. But even if you calculate it at 3 animals per acre, in a 10-year period, just short of 123 million animals have perished in these wildfires. And as far as the pollution being spewed into the air, it's over 4 billion pounds, and that's toxic pollution. That's bad stuff. Failing federal policies. You know, the environmentalists don't show us these pictures often enough. You know, when you shut down logging and you shut down access roads and you can't get emergency crews in there to do initial attack on a fire and put it out when it's little, this is the kind of stuff that you end up with. And we need to do more talking about this. It's bad policy. Now, I'm not blaming the Forest Service. I am not anti-Forest Service. There's a lot of good people that work for our Forest Service. Their hands are tied by bad policies from Washington, D.C. And those priorities, those unwise priorities coming out of Washington, D.C. are destroying our environment, they're wasting our natural resources, and they're keeping poverty prevalent in rural Montana. Now, I'm a Republican, and I kind of see things and call it the way it is. But we have a Democrat governor, and here's what he said about this very issue in 2013. He was giving a speech at the Western Governors Association, 2013. He says there's a real high degree of frustration when it comes to management on our federal forest lands. Since 2000, 6.3 million acres of Montana's forests have been affected by the mountain pine beetle. 4.3 million acres of forest and rangelands have been impacted by wildfire. The urgency is so apparent. He goes on and he says, on our federal lands, wildlife habitat has been degraded, watersheds are at extreme risk, endangering key fisheries and clean water, fire danger is off the charts, threatening local communities and stifling recreation, to say nothing of the economies of our rural communities. And then he tells a story. He says, interestingly enough, about 6 years ago, a diverse group of Montanans came together to try to figure out how we could address these problems. Washington, D.C. wasn't really interested in finding solutions to these problems. Congress was too polarized to get anything done. They were told, yes, forest management's broken, but no thanks, we don't want to try anything new. Unfortunately now, this group that tried to get something done on the ground now believes the Forest Service and the overall system is simply incapable of getting anything done. The governor goes on and he says, we now can't wait for the federal government to figure out a solution. It's up to us as Westerners to really bring answers forward. And he goes back in his mind during the speech and he says, this reminds me of when I was on the land board for the state of Montana. He said, our state management system worked because we had 5 statewide elected officials that were responsible for the decisions on those lands. And the interest groups couldn't profit from suing the state of Montana because we don't have policies in place that allow those groups to profit from lawsuits. That was what the governor said in 2013. This year, an election year, when he wasn't up for election, he did a 180 on that. This is a letter he issued in 2014, and it's amazing because in April, March or April of 2014, that was April 7th, he gave this press release, and that's when he designated the 5 million acres at imminent risk in Montana, and those are the lands. It's all over here in western Montana that are under critical threat, imminent risk, high priority. Let's talk a little bit about, well, let's not, Washington, D.C. financial management. That's financial management, the debt to infinity and beyond, 1940 to present. I can't even keep this chart current. We're up over 18 trillion in debt now, and there's over 100 trillion in liabilities, unfunded liabilities at the national level. Now, some people say Montana can't afford to manage our own lands. We're not in debt. We balance the budget. We have to. That's our one constitutional mandate as a legislature, is to balance our budget, and we do. But do you remember that in October of last year when they were having a squabble over Obamacare and the budget, and Congress wouldn't pass Obamacare, and the president said, well, I'm going to shut down all the, I'm going to do a shutdown. We're going to have to do a shutdown. So they shut down all the non-essential services in the country. The presidential golf courses were left open. But our treasured places and our natural resources were closed. Logging contracts that were in place and rolling were shut down. Hunters that were in the backcountry in their hunting camp, this was archery season when this happened, they were told to get off. Federal agents actually went out of their way to go into hunting camps and tell hunters they had to leave the public lands because the government was closed. They kicked backcountry hikers off the rural routes in the backcountry where no supervision is ever present. We have our own search and rescue at the state level. We have our own law enforcement. We have systems in place to take care of emergencies on the land. It wasn't that. It was just to make it painful for us. And one of the federal agents that was giving an interview said that's what it was about, just to make it hurt. Make that shutdown hurt, because the president couldn't get what he wanted and Congress wouldn't agree, and they were having a squabble, so they were going to hurt us. And they did. In Utah, they had an $8 billion tourist industry that went dark overnight. We had busloads of people in Yellowstone National Park that were evicted out of there. They had planned those vacations. Some of those people came from other parts of the world to vacation in our national parks, and they were evicted in the middle of their vacation. Oh, and here's the other, we hear this criticism that if Montana takes the land, we're going to sell it. No, I don't think so. Can you imagine us getting away with selling the land? If our governor did a shutdown or started selling our public land, do you think that we would put up with it? No. But Congress has already done it, and they're doing it again. In fact, they've got a bill, this was passed out of a House committee in January, H.R. 2657, directing the Secretary of the Interior to sell certain federal lands in Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, and Wyoming. It amounted to about 90,000 acres in Montana. I still don't know where those acres are. All I got was a big report with no map, so I can't tell where those acres are. And I'm chairing the federal land study, and I find out about this from a constituent. There's no communication between Congress and the legislature, very, very little. Oh, and we'll go back once. This is an article that was in the Guardian News, and Ecuador has actually been forced to start auctioning off their lands to pay their debt to China. Good thing we don't have any debt to China, right? So why are we having all these budget problems? The Energy Institute of Energy Research just in 2013 did this inventory and shows we have $150 trillion in minerals locked up on the federal lands. Imagine if we could access just 1% of that, what that would do for the western state economies. We could run all western state governments for 10 years on 1% of that, without collecting any taxes. Here's another piece of data on the economic aspect of this. This was a study that was done in Nevada, commissioned a study on federal land transfer. And this is data from the actual government documents, and it shows the net profit per acre on state-managed lands is about $6.29. This was during a period back in the, it was a 4-year period around late 90s, so 89 through 94. Okay, so that back then, when they were still doing pretty well on the federal lands, they were still losing $1.86 per acre. We were making $6.29 an acre, they were losing $1.86 on every acre they managed. This is a little bit more current. This was 98 through 2001, and these were the different kinds of federal land ownership. So for every dollar that the Forest Service spent, they brought back 23 cents. For every dollar the BLM spent, they brought back 94 cents. For every dollar the National Park Service spent, they brought back 12 cents. And the average that we collected from state trust land management in all these western states for the public lands that we manage was $9.32 for every dollar we spent. So we make 10 to 1 what they make on the land management. This is a more current report. This was just done over a 4-year period, 2008 to 2012. And again, this is from a Nevada study. And they looked at the other states, the trust lands that were being managed on other states. And the bottom line is the 4 states they analyzed were generating $962 million on 24 million acres of state lands with 640 full-time employees. The BLM lost $31 million with 745 employees. And Nevada did an economic assessment of what it would mean to their state economically if they did take control of all the lands. Their public lands in Nevada are primarily BLM. If they took all 47 million acres of BLM land in Nevada, they found that they would have an average of nearly $1.6 billion a year injected into their revenue stream at the state level. And as far as the low end estimate, they said it would be $371 million, the worst they could do if they took over management of the BLM lands per year in Nevada. Go ahead. This is one of those things that kind of gets me going a little bit. I know it gets my husband going too, and probably you if you've ever been to these kind of meetings. This was a objection process meeting with the Forest Service. And in the audience are all these elected representatives of the people of Northwest Montana. There's some representatives of organizations in there. But a lot of those folks are county commissioners and state legislators that came to tell the Forest Service there's problems with your plan and we object to it. This is an official proceeding. Go to the next slide. Now, the guy in the middle is the decision maker. He's from Washington, D.C. He flew in that night, or the night before, and he said, boy, you've got a beautiful forest here. I just saw it for the first time. Now, what's wrong with this picture? Your elected officials are in the audience, and the decision maker's in the middle of the head table. He's seen the forest for the first time. He's not accountable to the people here, but yet he's the one that makes the decision on how these lands are going to be managed. Oh, by the way, it seemed like he was starting to listen to us, so they transferred him, so he's not the decision maker. Now we've got a decision maker we've never seen and never met, and has never met with us. So why the difference? Why are the states treated so differently? Why do some states have almost total control of all the land inside their borders and some don't? This gets kind of technical. Try to stick with me. Try to pay attention because this is the legal aspects of it. And I need you to be able to process this stuff and make the argument for me when you're talking to people out there. Or ask your questions if there's something you missed. But let's get through this as quick as we can. Transferring the lands to the state is the only solution big enough. You can try to reform Congress, but it's really not reformable. Every time they tinker with something, it seems to get worse. And they're doing a lot of horse trading there. You know, Arizona just got 7,000 mining jobs because they attached some pork to the NDAA bill, our National Defense Bill that had to pass. So Arizona gets jobs. Montana gets 67,000 acres of our natural resources locked up in wilderness, despite the representatives and the county commissioners being dead set against it, and all the recreation groups were dead set against that. But it was a trade. Arizona got what they wanted, and we got thrown under the bus. In Alaska, half the Tongass National Forest was given to a corporation. And this was all included in the National Defense Bill. Let's go. Okay, here's some key points just to keep in mind. The promises to the states at statehood are the same. I'm going to get into that with you. You'll see. All the states had an enabling act when we became states. It was a congressional act, and all the language in those is almost verbatim between every state. But yet out here in the West, we still get treated different. We don't get treated like the other states. It's already been done before. Eastern states were as much as 90% federally controlled at one time too. And this really is the only solution big enough.
What eastern states are you talking about?
Everything east of the Rocky Mountains, actually.
Missouri, Illinois, Iowa,
Yeah, Florida.
Louisiana.
Yep,
say the name of it.
Illinois.
Yeah.
Go ahead. So, this is some history for you. Back during the American Revolution, we had these 13 colonies that declared their independence, and they had claims. The colonies are in the orange. They had claims and grants to the green areas, to the west, what they called the western lands at the time. And they had to fund their war. They were going into debt, and they had to fund their war. So they came to a decision to put all those unappropriated lands that weren't official parts of the colony, they put them into a trust under the purview of the federal government that they formed, the National Trust. And the purpose was to form new states and to sell property so they could pay off the debt. So those were the two purposes. They put this land all in a trust so that new states could be formed and they could settle those lands and pay off the national debt. Here's the actual act, if you don't believe me. This is the journals of the Continental Congress in 1780. This was before our Constitution was even ratified. They said, resolved that the unappropriated lands that may be ceded or relinquished to the United States by any particular states shall be disposed of for the common benefit, pay off the national debt of the United States, and be settled and formed into distinct republic states, which shall become members of the federal union and have the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence as the other states. That said lands shall be granted and settled at such times and under such regulations as shall hereafter be agreed on by the United States and Congress assembled. Go to the next one. They also said that so much of the territory ceded or to be ceded by individual states to the United States shall be divided into distinct states. They said it would be on, each state would be on an equal footing with the original states. Go ahead. Now this is the United States Constitution. It's Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2. This is the property clause. The Congress shall have the power to dispose and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States, and nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular states. And this is going back to all those agreements they made that I just went through real quick. There's a lot more information on this. I won't bore you with all of it, but the key point is here, the U.S. Constitution gives the Congress the power to dispose. It does not give them the power to keep forever and ever and ever. The expectation was that that land would be disposed of. Whether it was sold or granted or transferred, it would not remain under federal control forever and ever and ever. So why the difference? We've got less than 50% of state-controlled land in the west and more than 95% state-controlled in the east. Go to the next one. So these were the western states Paul brought up. At that time, they were considered the western states. It was Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, and they were as much as 90% federally controlled at one time too. Go ahead, Teresa. But there was one man, one leader that refused to take no for an answer. He refused to be silent. His name was Thomas Hart Benton. He was a United States Senator from Missouri, a Democrat. And he had a lot to say about this issue, and he worked on it for about 20 years. He said the new states of the West were sufferers by this federal land policy. Does that sound familiar? They were in a different condition from the other states. In these others, the local legislatures held the primary disposal of the soil, so much as remained vacant within their limits. So the legislatures had the vacant lands within their states. And being of the same community with the people that actually lived in their state, they made equitable alienations among their constituents. In the new states, it was different. The federal government held the primary disposition of the soil, and the majority of Congress, being independent of the people of these states, was less heedful of their wants and wishes. It's the same story, it's just 100 years later. He said they, the federal government, were as a stepmother instead of a natural mother, and the federal government, being sole purchaser from foreign nations and sole recipient of the Indian cessions, it became the monopolizer of vacant lands in the West. And this monopoly, like all monopolies, resulted in hardships to those upon whom it acted. This is actually the resolution that they passed, the Missouri passed. It was an application in Missouri for a change in the system of disposing of the public lands. It was presented to the 20th Congress. And you'll see some language in there. It says that the system of disposing of public lands of the United States now pursued is highly injurious in many respects to the states in which those lands lie. The present system manifestly appears to them to be an infringement of the compact between the United States and this state, and that the state of Missouri never could have been brought to consent not to tax the lands of the United States whilst unsold, if it had been understood by the contracting parties that a system was to be pursued which would prevent 9/10 of those lands from ever becoming the property of persons in whose hands they might be taxed. So the deal was the land would be disposed. And we knew that when this became a state too. Well, you'll see that. Andrew Jackson in 1833, that was Thomas Hart Benton back in the 20s. And Andrew Jackson, who was president in 1833, actually vetoed a land bill. And this land bill was going to dispose of lands, but it wasn't going to do it in a fair and equitable way. And he says it's in the real interest of each and all the states in the Union, and particularly of the new states, that the price of these lands, these unappropriated lands, shall be reduced and graduated, and that after they have been offered for a certain number of years, the refuse remaining unsold shall be abandoned to the states. So anything that didn't get claimed in homesteading or sold or granted to the railroad should go to the states. That's the land bill veto message from the President of the United States in 1833. When Montana became a territory, we had this territorial act that was formed in Congress. And it also had similar language. It said the lands in the said territory shall be surveyed under the direction of the government of the United States preparatory to bringing the same into market. So the plan was always that Congress would relinquish these lands. Go ahead. Enabling Act, this is the one when we became a state. This was an act of Congress that the state agreed to. And it said that we forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated lands lying within our boundaries until the title thereto shall have been extinguished by the United States. So what this was language to give the federal government a quitclaim deed so that they could dispose of the lands easily without us interfering in it. And some people point to that language and say that, well, you forever disclaimed your land, but that same language is in all the other state enabling acts too. The Enabling Act also said that when the lands are sold, that 5% of the proceeds would stay with the state and would go into a trust fund for our common schools. And 95% of the money would go to the federal government for their national treasury.
Which is probably our best argument against the idea of the state selling out the land.
Yeah, when Utah passed the Transfer of Public Lands Act in their state, they actually put that language in their act. And they said if any of those lands are sold, even after they become state lands, they'll give 95% of the proceeds to the federal government. They'll keep 5% in their school trust fund. They disincentivize themselves from selling the land. They just want to manage them, and that's what we want here in Montana. We want to be able to manage them better. This is interesting because we share the same exact Enabling Act document with North and South Dakota. North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington all became states at the same time under the same Enabling Act. So this myth that you gave up your lands, go ahead and click forward. Well, that same language was in Alabama's Enabling Act, and they're only 2.7% federally controlled. It was also in, go ahead, Louisiana's. They're only 4.6% federal. One more. Nebraska, they were only 1% federal. They had the same language in their enabling. These are quotes right from their Enabling Act. Go ahead. So North Dakota's lands are 3.9% federally controlled. South Dakota's are 5.4%. In Montana, we have 27 million acres, and 12 million acres in Washington are federally controlled. Nearly 30% of our states are still under the control of the federal government. So why the difference? Go to the next one. Well, this isn't a new idea. The states have been pushing to get control of our lands for a long time. In 1932, there were congressional hearings on it. You saw the 1820s information on it, the actions that were being taken in Congress at that time. In 1932, the western states that are western states now actually started working on this with their Congress, and there were hearings. This is a copy of the report. It's called, if you look at the title, Granting Remaining Unreserved Public Lands to the States. These are congressional hearings. And they were getting ready to dispose of the land, transfer the lands, the federally controlled lands to the state. But what happened was somebody at the federal level decided they weren't going to transfer the mineral rights with the land. And so the states rallied and actually killed the bill and said, no, you got to keep the whole promise. I mean, how are we going to take care of the lands and produce revenues if we don't have the rights all the rights that go along with the lands. Oh, and then in 1934, there was the Taylor Grazing Act. And notice the first line in the Taylor Grazing Act, in that bottom paragraph there, says, in order to promote the highest use of the public lands pending its final disposal, the Secretary of the Interior, da-da-da-da-da. So that's the beginning of the Taylor Grazing Act. So this idea that we forever disclaimed all right and title is just a notion that's not rooted in any fact. Go ahead. And in 1976, okay, we're getting up to nowadays, kind of. 1976, Congress declares that it is the policy of the United States that the public lands be retained in federal ownership. So they actually came along and made a policy, an act of Congress that says, well, it's no longer our policy to dispose of the lands, now we're going to keep them in federal ownership. Can Congress change the terms of statehood with a new unilateral policy that the state didn't agree to? Let's see what the Supreme Court says. No. Enabling acts are solemn compacts, and they're bilateral, which means two-way agreements that are to be performed in a timely fashion. The federal government holds territorial lands in trust for the several states. Key Supreme Court decisions. This one, another decision, Pollard versus Hagen. Whenever the United States shall have fully executed these trusts, the municipal sovereignty of the new states will be complete. The United States never held any municipal sovereignty, jurisdiction, or right of soil in and for the territory of the new states except for temporary purposes and to execute the trusts. Hawaii, a little bit more modern. Hawaii got their Enabling Act done in 1959 when they became a state. And in their Enabling Act, they made the language more specific because they saw that Congress was resisting transferring these lands like they had promised to do. So Hawaii made their language more specific in their Enabling Act. They insisted on this language. It said the United States grants to the state of Hawaii, effective upon its admission into the Union, the United States, title to all the public lands and other public property within the boundaries of the state of Hawaii, title to which is held by the United States immediately prior to its admission in the Union. Still, the federal government tried to keep Hawaii's land, so they had to go to court. And in 2009, they won, and it was a unanimous decision. Here's what the Supreme Court said in that case. The consequences of admission are instantaneous, and it ignores the uniquely sovereign character of that event to suggest that subsequent acts, even acts of Congress, somehow can diminish what has already been bestowed. And that proposition applies with even greater force where virtually all of the state's public lands are at stake. Now, this decision in 2009 was the one that really got Utah going. It was actually the director of the Department of Education there. They're trying to figure out how to fund education there. And they know if they can access these public lands and get some economic production going again, they can bring in revenues for their schools and their state programs. And it was the director of the school system in Utah that found this case and brought it to some of his legislators and said, take a look at this. And that's where they took off, and within 2 years they passed a Transfer of Public Lands Act requiring the federal government to transfer the lands to Utah. And now they're working with the other states. They band together, and nothing has asked for it. Hopefully we get Congress to act. But if they don't, we've got a solid legal case that shows that they have to. There's been several legal analysis done on this. This is one by the Federalist Society. It's a national organization, over 40,000 lawyers and scholars that came out with the first white paper on the Utah Transfer of Public Lands Act. The legal arguments are in favor of the transfer of public lands are serious, good and true. So there's been several others. Public Law Review by BYU. Numerous scholars are coming together on this and actually now coalescing with Utah to help them with their case. Go ahead, we'll just flip through some of these. This is Ken Ivory. He's the president of American Lands Council. He's become a good friend of mine because we have a lot in common in this battle. And he's the representative in Utah that wrote this Transfer of Public Lands Act. I asked him where he came up with this idea. Did some lobbyist write the bill? Did you get it from ALEC or the Koch brothers? And he says, actually, I was sitting in the bathroom one day and thought we ought to do this. So that's where the idea originated. Great things happen in the bathroom sometimes. But he says, if we fail to secure the same statehood promises and rights for our states and our future, it won't be because it's illegal, unconstitutional, or impossible. It will simply be because we and our leaders lack the knowledge and courage to do what has already been done before repeatedly. Go ahead. So what we've been doing is working with legislators and county commissioners and resource experts in the several western states And I went down there in April. Several leaders from the Montana legislature went down there to meet with other leaders from other state legislatures. And this was our working session. We're actually in a caucus room in the Utah Capitol working. We've got box lunches brought in. We're working all day long to try to figure out how we approach this, how we can get our federal partners to be a good partner and work with us. And then that's U.S. Senator Mike Lee in the middle there. And he was talking about this idea he had of actually making the federal government pay taxes on the land. At least then we get something. They're the biggest landowner in the country and they don't pay any taxes. Thought that was a novel idea. That meeting, we did hold a press conference after it. And I don't look very happy there, do I? And I'm not. I mean, why do I have to be there? Why do I have to be doing something that the government should have done a long time ago? Why do we have to fight for this? Well, because government grows and it holds on to power. Unless people get involved and get educated and start applying pressure, it's going to keep doing what it wants to do without us. These are a couple hashtags you can use if you're on any of the social media. Now, one of them, bigger than Bundy, we put in because about the time we were meeting in the Utah Capitol in April, that's the Bundy thing was going on. And so the media started immediately trying to tie us to Bundy. And said, no, we're elected officials. We're going about this in a way that's lawful. We're educating ourselves. We're asking Congress to act. We're not out there doing what Bundy was doing. It, right or wrong, but Bundy brought a lot of attention to the issue. Bundy is just a symptom of the conflict that we're experiencing all across the West. So it's not the only one. We're seeing this, it's just one that got a lot of media attention and got a lot of citizens that turned out to stand with that man. Resolutions of support. We would love Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife to pass a resolution of support in favor of transferring the lands, in favor of the legislature pursuing this. And we're not talking about kicking the feds out one day and the next day we take over. We're talking about supporting, working toward an orderly transfer, a good plan, one that's successful, one that works for the state and the nation as a whole, one that's good for all of us. We've got to get things in place before we make the shift. But first we've got to get the political will to start doing that, to start planning for it. Utah, I was down there for their state Republican convention. It was great. I was, no offense if there's any Democrats in here, but it was so great being in a room with 4,000 Republicans when they passed the transfer of public lands. And I hope the Democrats do the same thing when they realize how much this can help our lands, our resources, our people, our institutions, our budget. And I hope eventually they will too, but so far it's been kind of partisan. The Republicans see the light, they like this idea, and the Democrats have been very resistant to it, but there's a few starting to come along. This was a Republican National Committee resolution that passed unanimously in January supporting the transfer of public lands. Next one. Then in June, the Montana Republican Party passed it. Now, these are Montana Republican delegates from every community in the state. This isn't top down. This is the grassroots. These are your neighborhood delegates that you elected. Your Republican committee people that were elected in your neighborhood went to the state convention. And I presented this resolution. Actually, Paul presented it in committee and got it passed out in committee. I brought it to the floor amongst 200 Republican delegates from all across Montana. Have you ever known Republicans to agree on anything 100%? Well, this day they did. It was historic. June 21st, 2014, they unanimously passed a resolution calling on the transfer of the public lands and a plan to start moving in that direction. And it's not just a Republican thing either. We're getting resolutions gathered from cities, counties, states, school districts, education associations, trade unions, chambers of commerce, economic development councils, user groups, resource industries, the Farm Bureau, the cattlemen. Let's go on, I'll show you a couple that we've got. National Association of Counties actually passed a resolution of support. They did it in 2013 and then they made it a part of their platform in 2014. So the National Association of Counties backs this. In fact, it was counties that formed the American Lands Council and hired Ken Ivory to lead their charge. And this is the Coalition of Montana Chambers of Commerce. Before I got involved in this, they had already passed a resolution of support, or it was a statement in their joint position papers. And this is the chambers from Billings, Bozeman, Butte, Great Falls, Helena, Kalispell, Missoula. And on their section on economic development, they said the chamber encourages the state of Montana to adopt a policy requesting the transfer of management of federal lands where appropriate to the state of Montana. And then this is the Washington School District of Utah's resolution. South Carolina passed a resolution of support for us. They realized that this is their problem too, because the eastern states are actually sending billions of dollars out here. They call it Western welfare. They're giving us money to not manage our resources, to not utilize our resources, to not take care of ourselves. And so I expect we're going to see several eastern states pass resolutions supporting this. I've personally talked to legislators in 15 different states that said they would carry a resolution supporting the transfer to the western states. So why transfer lands in a nutshell? We want to protect public health and safety, that's why. We want to protect our environment. We want to protect our wildlife. We want to protect multiple use access. We want to protect and grow our economy. And we want to place the stewardship and the revenues from Montana's public lands in Montana's hands.